Hello and welcome to the seminar on how to move forward from trauma, creating positive perspectives. My name is Dr Linet and I'm creating these seminars for the public. My aim is for people to understand what's happened to them during the pandemic. I'd actually like to ask at the end of the session for a donation of $5, giving my time, effort and knowledge into educating and supporting the community. And I'll, at the end of it, there'll be details of how to donate. Okay, so a little bit about me. I initially trained back in 1986 overseas, became a nurse. In 1991, I returned to Australia, and that started my 35 years of working through different areas of healthcare, hospital, community, emergency, forensic training, police, community, custody, prisons, private practice, through immigration, military, education, and online presenting and learning. Please forgive me, I'm not really au fait with the PowerPoints. 96, commencing my forensic training, specialising in forensic training, becoming a mental health specialist, a non-prescribing practitioner under Medicare. I voluntarily deregistered through APRA in 21. I'm actually deaf, I'm profoundly deaf, and I use lip reading. I have my other language, Auslan, and I use my voice, obviously, because you can hear me. I'm an animal lover. I have obsessive cat disorder, as my family quite happily point out. So today's session is how to move forward from trauma. And I'm going to be talking as 4 major points that I'd like to go through. Identify trauma and rejections, and that's taking steps to dealing with abandonment, betrayal and social isolation. Recognising trauma, that includes acute stress disorder and PTSD. I'd then like to move into gaslighting, horizontal violence and stages in relation to home and the workplace, and then letting go of expectations, and that's usually anger. So the first point is identifying trauma and rejection, and that includes abandonment, betrayal and social isolation. So defining trauma. Now, I'm not wanting to insult anyone's integrity. Most people know what trauma is, and it's actually the response to a deeply distressing or disturbing event, and that is really overwhelming in a person's life. That affects their ability to cope, causes feelings of helplessness, and it diminishes your sense of self-worth and the ability to feel a full range of emotions and experiences. And it does not discriminate, it affects everybody, and it's really quite pervasive throughout the world. So in life, every painful experience that we have, it actually can be narrowed down to 3, I suppose, core wounds, if you'd like to say these. They are rejection, abandonment, and betrayal. Now, these core wounds, they're like a little family unit where each one has a specific energy. So these are triggered when we think back to anything sad or devastating that's happened to us. And the 3 feelings or common denominators that are associated with these are separation, loss, and broken trust. So with rejection, rejection's a refusal to accept, approve, or support something, and that refusal to show someone the love or kindness that they need to or expect. The feeling that someone does not love or want you. And rejection often feels like a knife in the heart or a punch in the gut. And researchers have found that rejection and physical pain can cause the same areas of the brain to light up. And so when we get rejected, our brains feel like we've just experienced physical trauma. And it's actually real, it's quite a real feeling. So evolutionary, the reason for our fear actually comes back from the hunter-gatherer days, way, way, way back whenever. And as we were part of a clan or a tribe, so each person had in that community had a specific role that supported everybody else. So if someone, for whatever reason, doesn't pull their weight or couldn't get the job done, They may have been cast aside or thrown out of the community together. And that would mean isolation and probable death for that person. But in today's society, we also have tribes. This is social media, this is our friendships, groups that we belong to, and we often fear that we won't belong to them or that they actually don't understand us. And at the same time, we actually depend on that tribe in some way. It's a give-take situation. And sometimes that causes us, we don't want to lose our place in the race, basically. Our basic need for most people is to be accepted. And that's part of our evolutionary function. And so rejection actually physically feels, and because it may lead us to be cast out, and it just makes us feel awful because that's something that nobody wants to experience. So dealing with rejection, when that happens to us, we need to have an appropriate grieving period. So you're actually allowed to be upset. It's quite healthy for you to give yourself some time to process and grieve for whatever's happened. Talking to a trusted friend or family member, community group, church, whatever it is that you're belonging to, and that usually your friends tell you to your face, basically, tell it to you straight, and they can often give you another perspective. Accepting the rejection early. So the earlier you accept it and attempt to move on from it, the easier time that you're actually going to have with it. It also means that you most likely won't let rejections in the future absolutely flatten you, because that's what can happen. Not taking rejection personally, that's a really hard one to do. Remember that rejection says nothing about you as a person. Getting rejected actually is part of life. It's the same as like not being vaccinated. You know, it's a government thing. It's nothing to do with you. It's for other people. Doing something else, needing to get your mind off the rejection after the appropriate grieving time. Reframing the rejection, using the terms such as we had different priorities rather than they rejected me. Knowing when to quit, that's recognising when it's time to give up and move on. Not allowing it to control your future. This is really important. Keep yourself moving forward. Dwelling on the past, rejections just keep you stuck in that past and stuck in the mud, and it won't let you enjoy the present. I liken it to that analogy of, you know, the windscreen of the car where you're looking forward because that's where you're going, but the past is this little mirror in the back and not looking back all the time. Because if you look back, you actually can't move forward. Use it to improve. Sometimes rejections can be a really big wake-up call and can actually help you improve your life, and just letting the rejection go and not dwelling on it. The next one's abandonment. So this is the act of leaving permanently or for a long time, especially when you should not do so. So the act of giving something up to withdraw your support or help from, and especially in spite of the duty, allegiance or responsibility, and it is another thing is like to desert. Abandonment can feel like a cold gust of wind and the floor's just been ripped out from under us. There's a sense of deep loss, being discarded, left behind, and feeling undesired. If we experience abandonment as children, whether it be physical or emotional, we learn to distrust boundaries, or simply we just don't have any. We learn to distrust authorities and also our sense of power, and we may overcompensate because we fear the loss of happening again. So with abandonment, our basic needs are threatened. That's how we feel. Usually by someone who has more power or resources than we do. And this can lead to a skewed power dynamic in all relationships. And that keeps repeating if we're not aware enough or acknowledge it and to heal it. When we are abandoned, our sense of self-worth is jeopardised. So we feel that something about us just isn't good enough for people to stick around or meet our needs. Makes it more difficult for us to trust and be intimate. It also can lead to anxiety, depression, and codependence in relationships. Abandonment also can lead us to a feeling of never being able to relax, and that warning centres in our brains have been compromised, and it actually makes us more difficult to be present, and it causes us stress, physical stress indeed. So we're actually be trained to look on the lookout for signs of when or how someone will abandon us next. And people who suffer from fear of abandonment can often feel isolated, fearful of intimacy because of the previously broken trust. And not feeling safe to get close to others actually causes anxiety, depression, nervousness, and actually can lead to poor self-esteem. So with dealing with abandonment, there's quite a few things to take into consideration. Not having unrealistic expectations. So that can tend to make you overreact and become needy. And when these aren't fulfilled, you have the fear of being abandoned coming back to you in full force. So it causes an obstruction with the process of getting over the abandonment issues that you had signed up for previously. Finding healthy outlets, and that is in order to recover from the constant fear of abandonment issues, it's really important to ensure that you find healthy outlets to channel that fear and fight it back. So taking full responsibility of actually how you feel, rather than cooping yourself up in the room, eating chocolate, drinking alcohol, or running away from your feelings. Stop beating yourself up. So it's actually human nature to start blaming things on ourselves when we struggle to get things right. And specifically in ways to deal with the abandonment issues, it's actually important we ensure that we stop beating yourself up. That's because of somebody else's actions. So you need to understand that the fear of abandonment is actually an involuntary action. It's not necessarily something that you did to cause it. Owning up to the problems, however, if you did do it, is to do ways to fight them back, is actually really good rather than beating yourself up. But if you own up to it, you can actually help yourself get over it. Identifying what causes the fear. Okay, so often at times what happens is we've got the instilled notion of abandonment in our heads, but you don't actually realise what's causing it in the first place. Realising the fear or the trigger of that will help you cope with these abandonment issues a bit better. It's not having a better, you're not just going to have a better perception, but you're actually going to be able to fight back when you know what's causing it in the first place. So technically, it does take quite a lot of time to realise what's causing the problem, because we fear reliving those times that have affected us with such intensity. And if you struggle to find the same, don't stress, but just take your time through the process, and the rest usually sort of falls into place. Working on your self-confidence. Now, not many people realise this, but your self-confidence does define you as a person of who you are. And you're not usually able to conquer things effectively if you don't know about the ways of boosting your own morale. It is important you work on yourself to find better ways to cope and deal with abandonment issues and that constant underlying fear of not being good enough. Stop with the generalisation. So we're often stuck in something that maybe happened years back, and this is where the problem stems from. So if you've experienced something, say from your childhood, the chances are that that same thing might have been like ingrained in your mind, and it makes it hard for you to get over this. And so it's a constant fear of not being good enough. The imposter syndrome is also part of this as well. It's important to stop generalising. So just because something happened when you were a kid and you encountered someone who wasn't good enough doesn't mean that every last person on this planet is the same. Generalising is one of the things that we do a lot, and it's exactly what we shouldn't do. If your abandonment issues stems from one person, don't think that every person you get close to is going to do the same. It's definitely not how it works. Practicing emotional self-reliance. So one of the best ways to deal with this is by ensuring that you stop relying on other people for your needs and how they dictate your life. If you don't want to experience history repeating itself, it's really important to ensure that you practice self-reliance. That is not giving anyone the power over your life and how they dictate it. Prepare yourself for the worst at all times, not exposing your vulnerable side, and to give them that power over you. Self-reliance and self-dependency is one of the best ways of dealing with abandonment issues. When you're on your own, even with people surrounding you, you still have complete dictatorship of your own life, especially when it comes to making decisions. Check if your thoughts are objective. Often we let our thoughts become really irrational, and we find ourselves in a situation where we assess whether or not our thoughts are actually rational or not. So owing to the fact that we're usually subjective with our thoughts, it's very common to have thoughts that have nothing to do with our overall fear. Fact checking in times of when you're really anxious is also important. So all you do for that is distance yourself from the source and then try and find better ways in your head to channel your constant worry. So think things through and see whether or not these feelings that you have within you are actually worth the time or a complete waste altogether. Stopping the irrational fear that's got no base to it in the first place. Instead of constantly thinking people are going to leave you, try and think of a positive and optimistic outlook to it. Practice mindfulness. Most people know about mindfulness these days. A constant unrest in our mind often is the condition of the underlying fear. Healing abandonment issues come from within, and you can't physically do anything unless your mental health is in a good space and a good shape. If starting by having a mindful approach to your well-being, so not letting things distract you from gaining that peace of mind altogether. Using meditation is a really great and amazing way to tame your mind, and finding a way to channel all the negative and dark thoughts that you may be thinking. This is taking time out of your day. It's like 5 minutes, and practice a mindful meditation, focusing on one object and sitting there looking at it, emptying the space in your head, and becoming calm and in control of how you feel. When you have control over your life, fighting back through this unrest actually becomes easier. Peek within yourself. That's like looking within yourself. So if you've experienced abandonment in the past, try and reflect on what happened. Why did that happen? And chances are, if you find yourself being a problem, or that your behaviour is the trigger that pushes people away, maybe looking at yourself and your behaviour about what was the cause of the problem in the first place. So you may not realise this, but sometimes it could be, you might have been the rift or the problems within the relationship. If that's the case, try and look at your behaviour, and hopefully that will improve if you're really honest with yourself. Working on yourself, not because you want to be perfect for someone else, but you want to do that to have a life that's your own and that you have complete ownership of. And this is going to help get the issues that you face to deal with any abandonment issues altogether. Taking up a hobby is one of the really good reasons behind the fear, and also can come if having a mind that's just going 10 to the dozen. If you take a hobby, if you find you're preoccupied by everything that's happening around you, finding a hobby that you actually enjoy doing and spending time in that is going to help distract you, rather than holding yourself up somewhere in negative thoughts through what's happening in your mind. A hobby could be anything that interests you, and usually once you focus on that, I have artwork that I do to take my mind off things, and that actually just gives me a bit of peace in the moment. Seeking professional help. Best way to go through abandonment and fight that is talking to someone who knows what they're doing. So oftentimes you'll find that it does become quite hard to handle, and seeking out a professional is one of the best ways to deal with the issues. People often struggle with their own self-esteem, and being affected by that, and with everything that's going on in the process, with therapy, it can actually give you a bit of guidance in how to handle what's happening in your life, and that can actually help to combat the problems that you're struggling with. A therapist is a good way of guiding you through the issues that you've been struggling with. There is self-help stuff online, but often it's really good to talk to somebody who you're not attached to or And dumping on a stranger, dumping problems on a stranger is actually really good, because it just gives that feeling, yeah, I've done it, and getting some advice. Pardon me. The next one is betrayal. And this is interesting because betrayal is a deliberate act of disloyalty, and to be unfaithful in guarding, maintaining, or fulfilling, and it's to disappoint your hopes or expectations. It's being disloyal, and it's actually the act of not being loyal when other people believe you are loyal. So betrayals, the root of betrayal is from the Middle English word betrayen, and that means mislead or deceive. And betrayal is like rejection and abandonment got together and they decided to throw a party. And they've got some loud, raucous guests and they refuse to go home. And the worst part, the key component of betrayal, and that's why it usually hurts, is because it's usually premeditated. And this cuts us into right at our core, and it can cause deep ravine, and it creates this concept, and I'm going to explain this. It's called dramatic irony. So dramatic irony, for example, is when you're watching a play like a pantomime and the audience is aware what's going on in the plot, but the characters in the play don't know. So the audience is in on the joke, he's behind you. But the actors discover it in real time. So a betrayal is often formed of this dramatic irony. So the person doing or about to do the betraying is in on it, but the receiving party, like you, leads to shock and a sense of being paralysed. And when we're betrayed, we can actually feel outright stunned. It catches us off guard, and it is incredibly jolting. And furthermore, our sense of security is absolutely deeply threatened because it's just come out of the blue and sort of knocked you sideways. Deep disappointment and distrust in others. We've got personally rejection, abandonment, and betrayal actually can play out within ourselves. So think about how many times we've rejected those parts of ourselves that we thought were embarrassing or not good enough, and we abandon ourselves to be part of our group, and we betray ourselves because we're too scared to be like singled out and be the lone wolf and have the attention put on us. So the next times you feel that you're out of sorts, asking yourself, do I feel rejected? Do I feel abandoned? Do I feel betrayed? Or is it a combination of all three? So the aftermath of a betrayal, when something happens to you, there's a few ways of dealing with this. And the first one is naming your feelings. And betrayal, as I said before, is an act. So the emotions that result from it are what we mean when we say we're feeling betrayed. In order to start recovering from that, you must be more specific about the feelings it's given rise to. So some of the more common ones that you might encounter, and these are basic ones, it might be more, is anger. So you've been hurt. This is one of the most natural feelings in such situations is anger, like how dare they? How could they? And, they'll pay for this. Sadness, you might become really low, weeping even when you discover a betrayal. It might be because you feel a sense of loss, that sense of trust, the loss of the person you thought they were, the loss of the happy memories you've got of them, the loss of the future you saw with them. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross has got a book on the 5 stages of death, and I akin this to that because you're going through this whole range of emotions that happens. Surprise, yep, you're probably shocked to find that this person or people have betrayed you, and you may not have had any idea that this was going to happen. Fear, worrying about the consequences of this betrayal, so it may mean major upheaval in your life, and things of the unknown actually can scare a lot of people. Disgust, you actually can't even bear to think about it or them because it makes your stomach churn. Some people physically vomit because the effect is so traumatic on their system, it's an automatic purge. Insecurity, questioning yourself and doubt whether you are worthy of love and care. And after all, the person who betrayed you clearly felt that you weren't. Now, shame, this is a big one because you can blame yourself and feel ashamed by what's happened. And now how other people see you and treat you. And this could be your family, friends, community, church, whatever. Loneliness, this is your betrayal and nobody else's. Like, how could anybody possibly understand what I'm going through? Confusion, you may not simply be able to comprehend what's happened. None of it makes sense to you. So this is going, the next time, following on from this, I'm going to discuss recognising trauma, which is acute stress disorder and PTSD, because all these things leading up to it can lead into these feelings. So long-term trauma is called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And this happens once the initial acute phase of trauma that's been processed, what I've just talked about, all these feelings, emotions of abandonment and things that have happened to you. So there's usually two phases of trauma. And the first one is called the acute phase, or acute stress disorder, or ASD. And that lasts for around 4 to 6 weeks when someone is exposed to or involved in an extreme trauma. So example is witnessing or being involved in or learning about events, serious accident, death for themselves or others. And also with the pandemic, I'm going to go through how it's affected a lot of people who've had the shock of being terminated from employment or loss of work, being unfairly dismissed following either loyalty relationships or work. And this applies to professional and personal relationships where you're actually being ghosted by family, friends, employers, or it just knocks you out of the park and you're in such shock. It is like a death because you've lost your house, your home, your love, people that you were close to. Right, so what happens? Okay, so you may experience difficulty concentrating. This is the initial phase, the ASD. Being detached from your body, experience the world as unreal or dreamlike, feeling numb, have increasing difficulty recalling specific events of the trauma. And we actually call this dissociative anemia, a dissociative amnesia. So it's actually a real event. You're not going crazy, believe me. The person can develop severe anxiety, and this is because you get flashbacks and you relive the event. And because of this, you avoid anything to do what's happened. You can have reduced emotional responses. You can find it impossible to experience pleasure in everyday life. Your sleep can be affected. You become hypervigilant. That means where you're sort of on guard all the time and looking for things to come and at you. You frequently feel guilty about being alive, and that's just not fair. And why I'm still alive and it shouldn't be. Also having the feelings of intense fear, helplessness, or horror. Now, these symptoms, as I said, are the first 4 to 6 weeks after the trauma. They're not usually caused by any pre-existing medical problems like your drug use, alcohol, or any psychotic issues, usually. So the difference between ASD and PTSD, so ASD symptoms start in the first month of the trauma and usually goes away once you've processed what's actually happened. And if the person doesn't seek help or has it resolved within this time, 4 to 6 weeks, it possibly can go into PTSD. Sometimes the symptoms are hidden and may not appear until years after the event. And when they do, the symptoms can cause significant problems in your social, your work, or your relationships, and they can also interfere with the ability to go about with normal daily tasks. So we're going into PTSD now, and so what are the symptoms of that? So there's usually the symptoms are generally grouped into 4 types. You've got intrusive memories, avoidance, negative changes in thinking and mood, and changes in physical and emotional reactions. So symptoms can vary over time, or they vary from person to person, depending on the resilience to deal with these, as well as what triggers your actual memories. So intrusive memories, so this may involve recurrent, unwanted, distressing memories of the trauma. So that's where you relive the trauma like it's happening again and again, and these are actually called flashbacks. Unfortunately, I'm going to be discussing with what's happened over the pandemic. Mainstream media is continuing to report on what's been going on, viruses and outcomes. And so this actually becomes, current in the person's mind. And it's really hard to unless you switch your television off, it's really hard to ignore because it's on the radio, it's newspapers, it's everywhere. So when you're sleeping, you may have upsetting dreams, you might have nightmares, and you can also experience severe emotional distress or physical reactions, avoidance. Now, this is where the person tries to avoid thinking or talking about what happened. So they also avoid going to places. You don't want to go to work. You might have to go to pick up something. You don't want to do it. Doing activities or meeting with people that remind them of the traumatic event. That's your social networking, church, community events, going to the shop where you might be in a small town, because this can lead to negative changes in your thinking and your mood. And this is where you can experience negative thoughts about yourself or other people or the world in general, feelings of hopelessness about the future, memory problems, that means I'm not remembering important events or aspects of the traumatic event. You could have difficulty maintaining close relationships, becoming detached from family and friends, lacking interest in activities that you once enjoyed, difficulty experiencing positive emotions, that's a really common one, feeling emotionally numb, and so is that, changes in physical and emotional reactions. So I'm going to go through some of the physical changes and emotional reactions now. They're called arousal symptoms, and this may include being easily startled or frightened. If you're like an army or military person and a gun goes off and you've had trauma from that and your car backfires, that sort of can shock you. Always being on guard for danger, as I said, like hypervigilant. The self-destructive behaviour, like drinking too much, driving too fast, using drugs inappropriately, having trouble sleeping, concentrating, being irritable with angry outbursts or aggressive behaviour, and have the overwhelming feeling of guilt or shame. Now, for some people, the symptoms can vary in intensity over time and can increase when you're feeling run down, when you're feeling stressed in general, or when you come across reminders of what you went through. So as I said before, you have a car backfire and relive your combat experience. You might be going through paperwork and you're finding an invoice or something from work, reading a book or an article in the newspaper, and it describes a similar situation that you went through. Or you may say something on the news and become overwhelmed by memories of what happened to you. So the question is, why is it some people get PTSD and others don't? And is one person more at risk than the other? So doctors actually aren't sure why some people get PTSD, and most mental health problems, people of all ages can have PTSD. Some factors may make you more likely to develop it after a traumatic event. So you've got experiences such as stress. So that includes the amount and severity of trauma that you've gone through in your life. So if you've had an experienced trauma early in life, like it's childhood abuse, you've got features of your personality, and that's often called your temperament. And the way your brain regulates the chemicals and hormone in your body, and that releases, that's in response to the stress. Work, so having a job that increases the risk of being exposed to traumatic events. So if you're a first responder, police, military, hospital personnel who have been exposed to this continuously, having other mental health problems like anxiety or depression, having problems with substance misuse, excess drinking or drug use, not having a good support system of family, friends, community, church, whatever, and having blood relatives with mental health problems, and they could have also have anxiety and depression. So the most common events leading up to the development of PTSD is working in a job where trauma happens every day, as I said, police, hospital, first responders, combat, childhood sexual abuse, sexual violence, physical assault, being threatened with a weapon, being involved in a serious accident. Long term, what can happen? Okay, so PTSD can actually disrupt your whole life. It can affect your job, your relationships, your health, your enjoyment of everyday activities, And it can also increase the risk of other mental health problems like depression and anxiety, issues with drug and alcohol, eating disorders, and it can actually lead to having suicide thoughts or attempting suicide. So what I'm going to suggest now is that's an awful lot of information to process. Have a short break, go and get a coffee or walk around the block, and then come back and we'll talk about the next couple of points, which I'll go into. Okay, welcome back. The next couple of points I'm going to talk about is gaslighting, and this is through domestic horizontal violence in the stages. And I'm going to do this in relation to the workplace and to the community, to what's been happening over the last couple of years. So what is domestic violence? So again, I don't want to insult anyone's intelligence because most people know what domestic violence is. So domestic violence or abuse can affect different areas of a person's life. And the main areas that it's affected are psychological or emotional, physical, sexual, financial, spiritual, social, legal, reproductive, neglect, and I'm actually going to include stalking in that. So domestic violence can happen to anyone. It's a problem and it's often overlooked, excused, or denied. And by noticing and acknowledging it and the signs of violent or abusive relationships, that's usually the first steps to ending it. In relation to corporate workplace violence and what government have done around the world, the comparison is that they followed similar behaviours to what happens in a domestic violence situation. So I'll explain this a little bit more. So in general, domestic violence is usually a pattern of incidents where controlling or threatening behaviour happens, usually between intimate partners, family members, and that's regardless of gender, sexuality, and it results in violent, abusive or aggressive behaviour within the home. Now, as I said, I'm extending this to apply the same formula or cycle of violence that I actually believed happened within the community. So what happened in the community with work or government and media is they created a situation where people started turning against each other, and this they were instilling information from like daily public briefings. The health ministers and others in politics or media specifically spoke out and targeted non-vaccination persons, publicly shaming them. So they're using words such as unsafe, irresponsible, and going so far as to say that, you know, the virus will hunt you down and get you. And this implies that they set it up at this undercurrent in society where people felt they had the right to also view the unvaccinated or non-covered people as being unworthy of having the same rights as those who were vaccinated. This led to negative thoughts, words, and actions when they saw them in public. So this behaviour is also called splitting behaviour, and this is created by sociopathic or psychopathic persons who know how to set up a situation by promoting information where the aim is to create chaos. And they do this by splitting mainstream community, so they fight within themselves, and then the perpetrator, employer, government, whoever it is, media, sit back and they watch the fallout. So the information sets up the narrative and it creates this framework in your head, along with media or whoever went along with it. They happily went along with it. And they did this by showing grabs of official morning briefings, short sentences, and that actually cemented into the unvaccinated people were to blame for this COVID disaster. So domestic abuse falls into this common pattern of cycle of violence, and that was followed by, very cleverly followed by the governments around the world. And I apologise for the blurriness, I won't stay on this very long. So you've got the cycle of violence, you've got the build-up phase, the standover phase, explosive phase, remorse, pursuit, and then the honeymoon phase. So what actually happens in the domestic violence situation? So the abuser doesn't play fair. They use acts of violence, fear, guilt, shame, humiliation, intimidation, isolation, and exploitation. And they do this to wear you down and keep the person under control. So they may also threaten, take their money to prevent them from leaving, as well as monitor their behaviour or frighten, punish, or hurt the people around them, including children, animals, and personal belongings. So in the case of the government, I'm talking about Australia, they created situations using fear, guilt, shame, humiliation, where people became isolated and could be monitored and targeted easily. And this was evidenced by the commencement of the mask mandates in public and in the workplace. That's to start with. They then moved to more invasive methods. And this was to create fear and submission when they introduced threats of financial fines to employers, so they could ensure that all staff were informed that they had to do the right thing for the good of the community. And that is the use of emotional blackmail and guilt. And, you have to get vaccinated. And if you didn't comply, then you'd be sacked, which is what happened. So if this wasn't enough to get you to comply, when people did complain and respond because of lots of peaceful protesting, the police were instructed to use physical violence, and there is actually evidence of Victoria Police shooting people with rubber bullets, using pepper spray, batons, physical restraint, and there's other control measures. And when the Canberra protest happened, they actually stooped to a new low, and they included these long-range acoustic devices, which they're called LRADs, and they caused hearing loss, superficial burns, and other physical and emotional issues on these peaceful protesters who gathered just to voice their concerns about what was happening in the community. So what was used to get you to comply with their wishes? Well, we had psychological and emotional, financial, and physical coercion. So, I didn't want it, but I have to have it to support my family. And they did that to get you to comply with their wishes. So the phases as part of this cycle of violence, you've got the build-up phase. So this is where the government and the media created the perfect setting for this to happen. So they built up the tension, starting fear-mongering amongst the community, increasing the tension so you would be responsible for killing the elderly or children if you got sick. And that was the message that they gave us. The standover phase, and they then began control by issuing mandates for masks, injections, the green tick, making people take an experimental drug, often against their consent. The remorse phase, they actually justified this behaviour, explaining how it saved millions of lives, dismissing and minimising those who protested. And people believe that because they kept saying, oh, thank God I had the jab. I was sick, but it would have been way worse if I wouldn't have had it. The pursuit, they then promised that freedoms would be reinstated if you complied. And that led back to the honeymoon phase. So they removed some restrictions and they allowed people to return to normal life and work. Then they built up the phase again. So the government media reported these new variants of this, creating this new virus in the community, creating fear, introducing new mandates, boosters, other injections that may occur in the future. So the example was the monkeypox. And they actually plant the seed that the general public just will not question and they comply with, because they've gone through this phase and they're used to it. Now they think, oh yeah, that's fine, and they get to trust them again. And the cycle and pattern just goes over and over again. So we're going to move on to the next stage, which is abusive behaviour. And is it the same as violence? Now, it's actually not, because abusive behaviour is a deliberate choice made in order to control you. So the person uses a variety of tactics to manipulate and exert their power. And this includes dominance. So they feel the need to be in charge of the relationship, and they'll make decisions for you and your family. So they tell you what to do, they expect you to obey without question. The abuser may treat you like a servant, a child, or like their possession. So an example of the government, they set in place mandates to control your behaviour, and you just weren't allowed to question this. The media explained the virus in simple terms to ensure that you understood. You were issued with a travel pass to go to work, a vaccination green tick to allow you to go to the shopping centre, but you were stopped from travel interstate by closure of borders, which they justified by spreading the virus. Humiliation. Now, this is where the abuser will do everything they can to make you feel bad about yourself and that you're worthless and that no one else will want you. And if they do this, then you're less likely to leave. So what they actually did was through insults, name-calling, shaming, and public put-downs. And these were all weapons of abuse designed to erode your self-esteem and make you feel powerless and not actually go up against the government. So the media and government campaign labelled those non-compliant as anti-vaxxers. They created a culture where it was okay for people in public to abuse anyone who didn't comply with the mandates. They got them to do their dirty work, basically. Isolation. To increase your dependence on them, the person will cut you off from the outside world, and they stop you from seeing your family or friends or prevent you from going to work or school. So you have to ask permission to do anything, go anywhere, or see anyone. So with the mandates, you're isolated in the community, you're separated from your loved ones. They stopped people going to school and work, and you were decimated by the staff were desocialising because you were made to work from home and still happening today. And it creates an increase in mental health problems and a huge increase in suicides. Humans are social animals. We thrive off each other. And when we don't have that, we get into our own heads and negative thought patterns can take over, as I mentioned earlier, and it leads to really horrific outcomes. The use of threats were done, keeping partners from leaving or scaring them into dropping charges. The abuser may threaten to hurt or kill you, your children, other family members, or even pets. They may also threaten to commit suicide, file false charges against you, or report you to child services. So the government arrested and charged people, even jailing them, for speaking out about the treatment of the mandates. Some parents who were divorced and separated, they had their children removed if they went against the mandates. Intimidation. The abuser may use a variety of intimidation tactics designed to scare the person into submission. This could be threatening looks or gestures, smashing things in front of you, destroying property, hurting your pets, or putting weapons on display. And the clear message is that if you don't obey, there will be violent consequences. Now, intimidation and police from the police and army if you went against the mandates. And this was evident in Victoria with the Ring of Steel. You couldn't leave the city, and when there was protests, people were physically assaulted and charged. They had police with guns patrolling the beach to stop people exercising who didn't comply with the mask mandates or 5 kilometre boundaries. I was stopped by police and army trying to get to the chemist, which was 10 kilometres away from where I live. It was frightening, absolutely frightening. Denial and blame. So you see, abusers are really good at making excuses. They blame the abusive and violent behaviour on a bad day, a bad childhood, anything, and they minimise the abuse or they deny it actually occurred and commonly shift the responsibility away from themselves and that somehow their behaviour is your fault. And so what the government did and the police, they blamed the behaviour on the fact that people didn't comply with the mandates and that normalised their decisions and that they deserved this treatment. So this type of abuse can be really damaging because the scars of emotional abuse are very real and they run deep. Long term, this type of abuse can still destroy our self-worth, leads to anxiety and depression, and makes a person feel hopeless, hopeless, and alone. The long-term effects of protests and violence on those who were present or knew about this will actually live with them forever. So for the majority of people who watch mainstream media, this wasn't shown and they were totally unaware of any protests occurring or any violent behaviour from the police. So does this behaviour lead to physical abuse? So incidents of physical abuse may only occur 1 or 2 times in a relationship, and it only takes one episode of violence to make a person afraid for their future, and that's just a given. If it's physical, there may be unexplained or frequent injuries like bruising, cuts, broken bones, damage to the home or property, any vast. The person usually dismisses it and says it's from a fall or they're just being clumsy. The government has set a precedence now so that the psyche of the general public is used to lockdowns, mandates, and being vaccinated when told to do so, and generally will be compliant in the future because they trust what is said on mainstream media and government announcements. At the same time, the government was hoodwinking the public, and now another term for this is gaslighting. A lot of people actually are aware now of what gaslighting is, but the term actually comes from the 1938 stage play Gaslight, where the husband attempts to drive his wife crazy by dimming the lights. Now, years ago, they were powered by gas, and so he's doing that in the home, and when his wife points it out, he denies that the lights changed. So this is an extremely effective form of emotional abuse, and it causes the person to question their own feelings, instincts, and sanity, and it really gives the abusive partner a lot of power. So there are a variety of gaslighting techniques that an abusive partner might have or use, and the first one is withholding. So this is where the abusive partner pretends not to understand or refuses to listen. For example, I don't want to hear this again. So in Victoria, Premier Andrews stating he won't listen to protesters as his emergency powers are in place and that people will just have to live with it. Countering. This is where the abusive partner questions the person's memory of events, even when they remember them accurately. So example, you're wrong, you never remember things correctly. So this is the Premier stating that he was misquoted and that the other person was wrong. Blocking or diverting, and this is where the abusive partner changes the subject or questions a person's thoughts. For example, oh, you're imagining things. This is the media changing the subject and not reporting the actual events, giving misleading information on purpose. Trivialising. The abusive partner makes the victim's needs or feelings seem unimportant. For example, oh, you're too sensitive. And this is protest as being dismissed by the media as being crazy, tin hat wearers and anti-vaxxers, even if they're not. Forgetting or denying, that's the abusive partner pretends to have forgotten what actually happened or denies things like promises made. Example, you're just making this stuff up. So the media glossing over the past events that happened, not reporting on or denying the protest even happened. This can lead to people becoming really emotional and angry because your expectations don't match what happened in the actual event. So we were told we were needed 2 injections and 2 weeks of lockdown to flatten the curve, which ended up with being green COVID pass, told to booster up, and then experiencing, I know in Victoria, 6 or 7 lockdowns lasting for, over a year. And I'm not surprised people became jaded and actually angry. And this is still going on today. And that leads me into the next section, which is letting go of expectations. Now, I talked about expectations, and a lot of it leads into anger. And I'm going to talk about anger as it's a normal emotion and it's experienced by everyone at different times. And people usually feel angry as a reaction to their thoughts or emotions, like when they feel hurt, frustrated, worried, jealous, confused, rejected, embarrassed, or powerless. And physiologically, the process of anger is usually defined in 3 stages, and that's escalation, explosion, and post-explosion. So most people recognise when they start to get angry. So your blood pressure rises, you feel frustrated, you maybe sweat because you want to explain or you want to get your point across in a discussion. You get agitated, and most people are able to stop going into this full-blown explosion stage where you often lay blame, rehash a past incident, or saying something you later regret. And in most cases, anger is really hard to deal with, and sometimes exploding absolutely feels good. And once it happens, however, after you explode, you get that feeling of physical deflation, you feel flat, you feel depressed, and then your rational thinking returns, and this can sometimes bring out feelings of guilt or remorse because it affected not, first of all, your behaviour, but secondly, long-term effect of your words or actions especially if it was directed at another person. So knowing your triggers and what sets you off. So I'm married and I have a blended family with 5 boys. I'm usually a really calm person, but needless to say, my triggers in relation to kids, and I think most parents have this, over the years, my fuse actually has become much smaller, especially when my kids know what buttons to press and to get a reaction, and most parents and people know that. My non-family triggers, this is a personal thing, 2 words, Centrelink and Telstra. If I'm on the phone and someone from overseas answers the call centre, from their call centre, I politely ask if they're in another country answering calls on behalf of the business. And if they say yes, I actually start feeling the rage building. I really hate inequity and the fact that this person's taken a job from someone in Australia that really rightfully should be theirs. And by this time, I get the phone and I hand it to somebody else, or I hang up before I get to the explosion, because it's not a pretty sight when you explode. Managing expectations and anger actually is possible. People will find strategies that work better for them than other people do. So that's completely fine, as long as you manage your anger in ways that don't lead to hurting yourself or others. I've got some brief suggestions to help with this. Acknowledge the role of your expectations. So instead of acknowledging that you're disappointed, it's often easier to turn the blame elsewhere, and this is where the escalation can happen. So example at work, you meet with HR expecting them to allow you to return to work as the mandates have been dropped. And you're told no, because the policy now states that all staff must be vaccinated. Your initial feeling is one of intense anger and rage, and here comes the explosion. And because you expected this to happen, because the majority of people have been allowed back to work, media is saying everyone's back to work, we're back to normal. It hasn't happened. So you then start to calm down and think rationally, which is your de-escalation and post-explosion. You realise the frustration you had has nothing to do with HR, but everything to do with your expectations. So you acknowledge it, yeah, you're going to be disappointed and upset, but your intense anger that you felt when you saw HR or read the letter, that disappears, and then you actually find it easier to deal with their decision. From an energy point of view, it's actually hard to maintain that explosive, intense anger and frustration that you have when you lash out at the first person, when you get bad news. Once the explosion of emotions has cleared, usually your rational side of your brain starts to make sense of what's happened, and you start to create thoughts as to how to deal with the disappointment or the decision. Changing your perspective. Sometimes it's as simple as the language that we choose to use with ourselves. So instead of saying, I'm not, you could decide to say, I am, encouraging you to seek out gratitude, looking at our glass half full. So I'm really disappointed, but I'm grateful that I won't be subjected to any potential side effects of the vaccine, so that's a positive. No, it hasn't solved your problem of getting your job back, but you've been spared potential future illnesses. Defining what you really want. So try asking yourself what you're really trying to achieve. That is, I want to return to work, I want to return to whatever it is, I want to do something. Once you identify it, you can adjust your course for how you want to do it and look for a different way to achieve the same result. So this may be going to Fair Work, changing direction altogether in a different occupation, joining an alternative society where your skills and knowledge are valued without any mandates. Rethink how you set your goals. So one of the best ways to let go of your expectations is to look at how you frame them in the first place. And too often, you actually set yourself up for disappointment before you even begin. And this is really important with all the changes that have been forced and coerced on everybody. Being realistic in what you want to achieve and plan how to go about it is going to help you with future potential disappointments. Last one is decide how to choose your mood. We can never be in complete control of what happens to us. We can only control how we choose to respond to the situation. Attitude of gratitude, I call that. Okay, so this is actually the end of the seminar. I'm including my bank details and I'm asking for a donation of $5. It doesn't seem much, it's like a cup of coffee. I'm doing this so I can try and continue to create and post these webinars for the community. I've lost not one, but two professions through this, what's happened. And I'm going to have to think about where I'm going for the future. So these are designed. My aim is to ensure that people have knowledge and understanding about mental health. I have a website, drlinet.com, drlinet.com, and on there I've got free information about mental health. I've got some really cute memes that you can put on your screensaver, animals with positive affirmation, positive mental health words, and I've got positive affirmation. I've got videos. Minute with Dr Linet is they're again free. You can have them and help you for daily thought patterns. I've got some videos for in Auslan, because I'm deaf, for the community on actual mental health and diagnosis and explaining different terminology. And these webinars I'm hoping to start putting up on the website as well once I get an idea of what people would like to hear. My email, drlinet@drlinet.com. And I thank you for your support. And my husband said I'm going to be trolled, but I really don't care, because you know what other people think about me is none of your business. It's none of my business. And in sign language, it's none of your business and none of my business. So I want to thank you very much for your attention, and stay well. I have to try and turn this off now. There.